In the marble halls of ancient Rome where emperors dined on peacock tongues, and senators bathed in milk and honey, there existed a darkness so profound that history itself has tried to forget it behind the grandeur of the Colosseum. And the glory of Roman conquests lay a systematic horror that consumed the lives of countless young boys, stolen from their homes and transformed into living possessions for the pleasure of the powerful. These were not mere servants or laborers, they were children, selected for their beauty, groomed for submission, and forced into lives of unimaginable degradation. Their stories have been buried beneath 2 millennia of silence, dismissed as uncomfortable footnotes in the grand narrative of Roman civilization, yet their suffering was real, their humanity undeniable, and their legacy a stark reminder of how even the most celebrated empires can normalize the most heinous crimes. Today we pull back the velvet curtains of history to examine one of Rome's darkest practices: the systematic enslavement and exploitation of young boys as concubines in the households of emperors, senators, and wealthy patricians. This is not a tale of ancient customs or cultural differences. This is a story of power without conscience, luxury built on suffering, and a society that chose to look away while children disappeared into gilded cages. What you are about to hear may disturb you. It should, for in understanding the depths of human cruelty we guard against its repetition. In remembering the forgotten we honor their memory, and in confronting the darkness of our past we illuminate the path toward a more humane future. The year is 117 CE. Emperor Hadrian has just ascended to power, inheriting an empire that stretches from Britain to Mesopotamia. Rome stands at the zenith of its power, its legions unmatched, its wealth beyond measure, but in the shadows of the Palatine Hill and villas scattered across the empire, a trade in human misery flourishes behind closed doors. Welcome to the secret world of Rome's boy concubines, where childhood ended at the slave market, where beauty was a curse and where the price of survival was the surrender of one's very soul. Their names have been erased, their voices silenced, but their story demands to be told. This is that story. Let us begin by understanding the world that created such horrors. Rome in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE was a study in contradictions. It was an empire that prided itself on law and order, yet thrived on conquest and subjugation. It celebrated family values while indulging in spectacular excess, and perhaps most tellingly, it developed sophisticated philosophies about human dignity while treating vast numbers of people as property. To understand how young boys became trapped in this system, we must first understand Roman slavery itself. Unlike the racial slavery of more recent centuries, Roman slavery was primarily a result of conquest. When Roman legions swept through Gaul, Germania, Britannia, or the eastern provinces, they brought back more than gold and glory. They brought back human beings, men, women, and children, to fuel the empire's insatiable appetite for labor and luxury. Among these captives, certain children faced a particularly cruel fate. Boys between the ages of 7 and 14, especially those deemed beautiful by Roman standards, were selected for a different kind of servitude. They were not destined for the fields or the mines. Instead, they would disappear into the households of the wealthy, where they would be groomed to serve purposes. That official Roman selection process. Historians were often too embarrassed to record in detail the selection process was ruthlessly efficient. Slave traders operating in markets from Delos to Rome itself would evaluate young captives like livestock. They looked for specific features: smooth skin, symmetrical faces, large eyes, and slender builds. Boys from certain regions, particularly Syria, Egypt, and Asia Minor, commanded higher prices. Due to Roman fetishization of exotic beauty, the traders knew their clientele well, and they knew what would sell. These children were torn from everything they had ever known. Many had witnessed the destruction of their villages, the slaughter of their fathers, the enslavement of their mothers. Now they stood naked on auction blocks while potential buyers inspected them like objects, checking their teeth, feeling their limbs, assessing their potential. The lucky ones were purchased quickly. The unlucky ones faced the uncertainty of multiple sales each transaction, stripping away another piece of their former identity. Once purchased, these boys entered a world designed to break their will and reshape their very being. They were given new names, often feminized Greek names that emphasize Their subordinate status, their native languages were forbidden, their cultural practices were erased, every aspect of their previous life was systematically destroyed, replaced with a new identity crafted entirely to please their masters. The physical transformation began immediately. These boys were subjected to rigorous grooming regimens that would seem extreme even by modern standards. Their body hair was removed through painful plucking or depilation with resin. Their skin was kept pale through confinement indoors and the application of white lead cosmetics, a practice that slowly poisoned many of them. Their diet was strictly controlled to maintain a slender boyish physique well into their teenage years, but the physical modifications went far deeper. Some boys were subjected to castration, either partial or complete, to preserve their youthful appearance and prevent the development of masculine features. This brutal practice, while officially discouraged under some emperors, continued in the shadows. The surgeons' knife stole not just their ability to father children but often their very sense of self, trapping them in a perpetual childhood that served their masters' twisted desires. The psychological conditioning was equally systematic. These boys were trained in music, dance, and poetry not for their own enrichment but to make them more pleasing companions. They learned to anticipate their masters' moods, to provide entertainment on demand, to suppress their own emotions and desires. Punishment for failure was swift and severe: beating, starvation, isolation, or worse. Success brought hollow rewards: better food, finer clothes, the bitter privilege of being a favored possession within the household. These boy concubines occupied a strange and precarious position. They wore silk while field slaves wore rags. They dined on delicacies while others survived on gruel, yet their golden chains were still chains. They could not leave, they could not refuse, they could not even claim ownership of their own bodies. They existed in a liminal space, neither fully human nor entirely object, treasured and despised in equal measure. The daily life of a boy concubine was a carefully choreographed performance. They would wake before dawn to begin their grooming rituals. Hours were spent on their appearance, hair arranged in elaborate styles, faces painted with cosmetics, bodies perfumed with expensive oils. They dressed in clothing that emphasized their youth and beauty, short tunics in bright colors, jewelry that marked them as valuable property, sometimes even golden collars that served as both decoration and symbol of ownership. Their days were structured around their master's pleasure. When the master entertained guests, they served wine with graceful movements learned through painful practice. They recited poetry, played the lyre, or danced while hungry eyes watched their every move. They were expected to be witty but not too clever, beautiful but not vain, available but not eager. Every moment was a balancing act where a single misstep could bring punishment or even death. The nights brought different horrors. Historical sources constrained by the tabas of their time speak in euphemisms about what occurred when the lamps were dimmed. But the archaeological evidence, the medical texts, and the occasional honest memoir make clear that these boys endured systematic sexual abuse. They were property, and in Roman law property had no right to refuse its owner's desires. The physical and psychological trauma of these repeated violations left scars that no amount of silk or gold could hide. Emperor Hadrian's relationship with Antinous provides perhaps the most famous example of this system, though it has been romanticized beyond recognition by later historians. Antinous was a Greek youth of extraordinary beauty who became Hadrian's companion when he was likely no more than 13 years old. For 7 years he traveled with the emperor, sharing his bed and his table until his mysterious death in the Nile at age 19. Or 20. Rien's grief at Antonius's death was spectacular. He founded cities in the boy's name, commissioned countless statues, and even declared him a god. But we must ask, what choice did Antinous have in this relationship? Could a boy taken into the emperor's household truly consent to becoming his lover? The power imbalance was absolute. To refuse the emperor meant death, to accept meant survival, but at what cost? The historical Antinous remains a cipher, his true feelings lost to time. We have Hadrian's grief but not Antinous' voice. We have statues showing his beauty but no words expressing his thoughts. Like so many boy concubines, he exists in history only as a reflection of his master's desires, his own humanity obscured by the myth-making of those who held power over him. Yet Antinous was exceptionally fortunate. Compared to most boy concubines, his beauty and the emperor's affection afforded him a level of protection and luxury that others could only dream of. For every Antinous who dined with emperors, there were thousands of nameless boys suffering in the villas of lesser men, their stories never recorded. Their fates never mourned. The poet Martial, writing in the 1st century CE, provides glimpses of these forgotten victims in his epics. He writes mockingly of wealthy men who surround themselves with beautiful slave boys, describing their appearances and behaviors in terms that make clear their sexual exploitation. What Martial treats as comedy was tragedy for the boys themselves, children forced to perform their own degradation for the amusement of their oppressors. Medical texts from the period reveal the physical toll of this abuse. Physicians like Celsus and Galen describe treating boys for injuries that could only have resulted from sexual violence. They write clinically about damaged bodies, but between the lines we can read the human cost. These were children whose bodies were broken by adult desires, whose pain was treated as a medical curiosity rather than a moral outrage. Legal documents tell their own grim story. Wills and sales contracts list boy concubines alongside furniture and livestock. Court cases occasionally mention them in passing. A boy who ran away and was hunted down, another who was murdered by a jealous master, yet another who was discarded when he grew too old to be desirable in the eyes of Roman law. These were property disputes, not human tragedies. The practice of keeping boy concubines was not limited to the imperial palace or the homes of the ultra-wealthy. Throughout the Roman Empire, any man with sufficient means could purchase a beautiful boy to serve his pleasures. Merchants, landowners, military officers, many kept these young slaves as status symbols and objects of desire. The practice was so widespread that moralists like Seneca felt compelled to condemn it, though their objections were often more about excess than exploitation. In the eastern provinces where Greek cultural influences remained strong, the practice took on different forms but remained equally abhorrent. Boy concubines might be trained as entertainers in addition to their other duties, learning to sing and play instruments. Some were educated in literature and philosophy, becoming companions who could discuss Plato while pouring wine. But education did not mean freedom. These boys remained property, their learning just another way to increase their value. The transaction records from slave markets provide heartbreaking glimpses into this trade. A papyrus from Roman Egypt lists the sale of a Syrian boy aged 12, skilled in music and pleasing to look upon, for a sum that would have bought several adult field slaves. Another document from Pompeii mentions a boy trained in Greek ways being sold to a wealthy merchant. These bland commercial terms mask the human reality. Children sold into sexual slavery with the full sanction of law, normalization, and custom. Perhaps most disturbing was the way Roman society normalized this abuse. Wealthy men would bring their boy concubines to public events, displaying them like exotic pets. Poets wrote verses comparing their beauty to flowers or gems. Artists depicted them in fresco and mosaics, forever frozen in poses of submission and availability. What we would recognize as child abuse was treated as a lifestyle choice, a mark of sophistication and wealth. The psychological mechanisms that allowed this normalization are familiar to students of systemic oppression. The boys were dehumanized through language referred to as delicier, delights, or pyri. Boys, regardless of their age, their suffering was minimized or ignored entirely when they showed signs of trauma, depression, self-harm, attempts at escape. These were treated as character flaws rather than natural responses to abuse. Some Romans did voice opposition to these practices, though often for the wrong reasons. Stoic philosophers worried that indulgence with slave boys made men soft and effeminate. Moralists concerned themselves with the corruption of freeborn Roman youth who might be tempted to emulate the appearance and behavior of concubines. The suffering of the slaves themselves rarely entered the discourse. They were seen as instruments of moral corruption rather than victims deserving of protection. The military conquests that fed this system created a vicious cycle. As Rome expanded, more boys were captured and enslaved. The wealth from conquest allowed more Romans to afford such slaves. The demand for beautiful boys even influenced military Strategy with some commanders specifically targeting regions known for attractive captives children became another form of plunder, their lives destroyed for the gratification of their conquerors. The trauma inflicted on these boys extended far beyond the physical and sexual abuse they were severed from. Their families, their cultures, their very sense of self. Many had witnessed extreme violence, the destruction of their homes, the death of loved ones. They were then thrust into a world where they had to please the very people responsible for their suffering. The psychological gymnastics required to survive such circumstances left deep and lasting wounds for those who aged out of desirability, usually by their late teens or early 20s. The future was bleak. Some masters, having tired of their aging concubines, would sell them to brothel, where they faced continued exploitation. Others might be retained as household servants, forever reminded of their lost youth and former status. A fortunate few might be freed, though freedom for a former concubine carried its own stigma and challenges the practice of manumission. Freeing slaves offers a complex window into these boys' lives. Some masters freed favorite concubines in their wills, perhaps out of genuine affection or guilty conscience, but freedom for someone trained from childhood to be a sexual object was hardly true liberation. These freed men faced discrimination, limited economic opportunities, and the lasting trauma of their enslavement. Many had no skills beyond those taught for their master's pleasure. Archaeological evidence from sites across the empire provide silent testimony to these forgotten lives. Burial inscriptions occasionally mention young slaves in terms that suggest their role as concubines. Grave goods, mirrors, cosmetics, jewelry hint at lives focused on appearance and display. In Pompeii and Herculaneum, preserved by volcanic ash, we find rooms clearly designed for the housing and display of slave boys, complete with erotic artwork that leaves no doubt about their purpose. The artwork itself tells a disturbing story. Fresco depicting mythological scenes of gods pursuing beautiful youths. Zeus and Ganymede, Apollo and Hyanthus provided cultural justification for real-world abuse. These myths transformed rape into romance, predation into divine favor. Boy concubines were sometimes given names from these myths, further blurring the line between mythology and reality, between gods and the men who played God. With children's lives, medical knowledge of the time limited as it was recognized some of the physical damage inflicted on these boys. Physicians wrote about treating anal injuries, sexually transmitted infections, and the complications from castration. They noted the higher rates of suicide attempts among young male slaves in wealthy households. Yet this medical knowledge led not to intervention but to better methods of keeping valuable property alive and functional. The economic consequences. Aspects of this system reveal its cold calculation. Boy concubines represented significant investments. Their purchase price, maintenance, training and grooming all cost money. Some owners even took out insurance policies on particularly valuable boys. When we read these ancient contracts, we must remember that each clause represents a human life reduced to monetary terms. A child whose worth was measured only in the pleasure he could provide. Religious festivals and public ceremonies often featured displays of wealthy men's concubines. During Saturnalia, the December festival of role reversal, boy concubines might be dressed in their master's clothes and allowed to give orders, a temporary inversion that only highlighted their usual powerlessness. At private dinner parties, they would serve guests while enduring groping hands and lewd comments. Their humiliation part of the evening's entertainment. The complicity of Roman institutions in perpetuating this abuse cannot be ignored. The legal system codified slave status as property. The military machine provided fresh victims. The economic structure created incentives for the trade. Even religious institutions which might have provided moral guidance often owned slaves themselves, including young boys used for various purposes. The entire edifice of Roman civilization was built in part on the suffering of these children. As the empire evolved, so did the practice of keeping boy concubines under Christian emperors, beginning with Constantine. There were attempts to regulate or restrict certain aspects of slavery, but these reforms were limited and often ignored. The abuse continued, now hidden behind a veneer of Christian morality. Boys were still bought and sold, still groomed and violated, but now their Suffering was cloaked in even greater secrecy and hypocrisy. The spread of Christianity throughout the empire created new tensions around sexuality and slavery. Church fathers condemned pederasty in strong terms, but their concern was primarily for the spiritual health of the perpetrators rather than the welfare of the victims. Boy concubines who had been sexually abused were often viewed as corrupted and unfit for Christian salvation unless they underwent extensive penance, adding spiritual trauma to their existing burdens. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, as the Western Roman Empire crumbled, the fate of boy concubines became even more precarious. Economic instability meant that many masters could no longer afford to maintain large households of slaves. Some boys were abandoned, left to fend for themselves in a world that had no place for them. Others were sold to new masters in the Eastern Empire, where the practice continued for centuries under Byzantine rule. The fall of Rome did not end the suffering, it merely transformed it into chaos of invasion and societal collapse. Vulnerable populations always suffer most. Boy concubines trained only for pleasure and servitude had few survival skills. Many likely perished in the upheavals. Others may have found new forms of servitude under Germanic masters who adopted Roman customs. Their individual fates are lost to history, but we can imagine the fear and uncertainty they faced. What lessons can we draw from this dark chapter of human history? First, we must recognize how power without accountability inevitably leads to abuse. The Roman system gave absolute power to slave owners, and that power corrupted absolutely when human beings are classified as property. When their suffering is legally and socially acceptable, atrocities become routine. Second, we see how societies can normalize the most horrific practices through a combination of law, custom, and willful blindness. The abuse of boy concubines was not hidden, it was displayed openly, celebrated in art, joked about in literature. An entire civilization convinced itself that the sexual exploitation of children was not only acceptable but sophisticated. This normalization of evil should serve as a warning about our own capacity for moral blindness. Third, we must remember the victims themselves. These were real children with names we will never know, dreams we can never recover, voices that were silenced 2,000 years ago. They loved and feared, hoped and despaired just as any child would. Their humanity was denied by their contemporaries, but we must not repeat that denial. In remembering them we restore a small measure of the dignity they were denied in life. The legacy of Rome's boy concubines echoes through history in various forms. The practice influenced similar systems in Byzantine, Islamic, and other cultures. The normalization of child exploitation in one powerful conclusion. Civilization made it easier for others to justify their own abuses. Even today, in the dark corners of our world, children are still trafficked, still exploited, still treated as objects for adult gratification. Modern human trafficking, child sexual abuse, and exploitation have roots that stretch back to practices like those of ancient Rome. The methods have changed, but the fundamental evil remains the same: the powerful preying on the vulnerable. Adults destroying childhoods, human beings treated as commodities. Understanding historical atrocities like the Roman concubine system helps us recognize and combat their modern incarnations. We must also confront the way history itself has been complicit in minimizing these abuses for centuries. Historians, mostly male, mostly identifying with the powerful rather than the powerless, have glossed over or romanticized these practices. Hadrian and Antinous were portrayed as a love story rather than an abuse of power. The suffering of thousands of nameless boys was reduced to footnotes or ignored entirely. Only recently have scholars begun to examine this history with the moral clarity it demands. The process of historical recovery is painful but necessary. Each piece of evidence, each inscription, each legal document, each medical text adds another voice to the chorus of the silenced. We cannot undo the suffering of the past, but we can ensure it is not forgotten. We can refuse to romanticize or minimize what happened. We can call it what it was: systematic child abuse sanctioned by one of history's most celebrated civilizations. This recovery also requires us to examine our own complicity in similar systems. How many products in our homes were made by child laborers. How many children in our world lack protection from exploitation? How many voices are silenced by poverty, by powerlessness, by the indifference of those who could help? The Roman elite looked away from the suffering in their midst. We must ask ourselves what suffering we choose not to see. The story of Rome's boy concubines is not just ancient history. It is a mirror held up to human nature itself. It shows us how easily civilized people can participate in barbarism when that barbarism is profitable and socially accepted. It reveals how the vulnerable have always paid the price for the pleasures of the powerful. It reminds us that progress is not inevitable, that civilizations can be technologically advanced and morally bankrupt at the same time. Yet this dark history also contains seeds of hope. There were Romans who questioned these practices, who saw the humanity in slaves, who argued for better treatment or manumission. There were boys who survived, who found ways to preserve some sense of self despite everything done to them. There were moments of kindness, of resistance, of dignity maintained against all odds. Even in the darkest systems, human resilience and compassion can survive. As we close this examination of one of history's most disturbing chapters, we must sit with our discomfort. The story of Rome's boy concubines is not easy to hear. It challenges our admiration for Roman achievements. It forces us to see the suffering behind the marble statues and golden coins. It reminds us that every civilization has its victims, and that the measure of a society is not its monuments but how it treats its most vulnerable members. The boys whose lives we have glimpsed had no choice in their suffering. We have a choice in how we respond to their story. We can look away as their contemporaries did. We can minimize their pain as historians have done for centuries, or we can bear witness, can carry their story forward, can ensure that their suffering was not entirely in vain. In remembering them, we commit ourselves to protecting the vulnerable in our own time. History is not just about the past, it is about how the past shapes the present and future. The systematic abuse of children in ancient Rome created ripples that spread across centuries and cultures. By understanding this dark chapter, we better equip ourselves to recognize and resist similar evils in our own time. The boys who suffered in Roman villas cannot be saved, but perhaps their story can help save others. Let their silenced voices speak through our remembrance. Let their stolen childhoods remind us of childhood's preciousness. Let their suffering strengthen our resolve to protect the innocent. The marble halls of Rome have crumbled, its emperors are dust, but the moral lessons from its darkest practices remain urgently relevant in a world where children still suffer exploitation, where power still corrupts, where humans still treat other humans as property. The story of Rome's boy concubines is not ancient history, it is a warning, a lament, and a call to action. May we have the courage to heed